back to On the Middle East after a longish pause. I was on the road in Armenia to cover parliamentary elections there. And that's what we'll be talking about on the show. It's kind of wild because the whole world seemed to be focused on the outcome. This is a landlocked country of 3 million, but the elections were seen as a big contest between Russia and the West. The incumbent Nikol Pashinyan, who was backed by Western leaders, including President Donald Trump, won with 49% of the vote. He wants to lessen Armenians' dependency on Russia and make peace with the country's historic enemies, Turkey and Azerbaijan. With me here to discuss the outcome and what it means for Armenia's future is analyst Tigran Grigoryan. Tigran runs the Regional Center for Democracy and Security, a think tank in the Armenian capital, Yerevan. Welcome to our program, Tigran.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, there's been incredible interest in this election, and the way it's being generally framed, at least in the international media, is that this was a contest between the West and Russia, with Nikol Pashinyan being the Western candidate, if you will, and most of his opponents being pawns of Russia. Do you agree with this framing?
Well, I think it's a bit more complicated than that. I would agree that these are the first elections in Armenia's independent history that are geopoliticized. And by that, I mean that all the major political parties that participated in the election had their foreign policy or geopolitical preferences, and all the external actors present in the South Caucasus also had their preferences in the race. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that this is just like an outright choice between the West and Russia. What we're talking about is a choice between this policy of diversification that the current government started in autumn 2022, when after an Azerbaijani attack, Russia was not capable or willing to fulfill its contractual obligations towards Armenia, and between these political parties who are in favor of closer ties with Russia. But it's not about some sort of a geopolitical foreign policy pivot, because there are realities on the ground. And these realities tell us that Armenia's structural dependence on Russia is still huge. Armenia depends on Russia when it comes to the economy, when it comes to the trade and energy. And the paradox of the situation is that despite this diversification policy and despite some of the successes in it, let's say in areas like defense cooperation, where Armenia has managed to substitute Russia with other actors like India, France, and other European countries, in the realms of trade and energy, these dependencies are still in place. And when it comes to trade, this dependence has even grown in the past several years. So every single foreign policy choice is, of course, in a way conditioned by these dependencies. Russia was using a lot this leverage during the pre-election period, when it started imposing economic sanctions and trading bans on Armenian exports to the Russian market. And this process might continue in the post-election period as well. But at this point, Armenia is not in a position to choose between Russia and the West. To do that, it first needs to mitigate these dependencies, diversify its economy, and everybody in Brussels, in Yerevan, and in other places understands that this is not a short-term process. It will take time to work on some of these issues.
But I mean, some people say that, in fact, especially the European Union, was kind of virtue signaling in Armenia, that ultimately Armenia is a small country. It certainly doesn't matter as much as Azerbaijan in the broader scheme of things. And it was a sort of low-cost way of poking Russia in the eye. And perhaps in some respects, it may have done more harm than good with, the extent of its intervention, if we can call it one, when it had this big summit, flashy summit in Yerevan just weeks ahead of the election, and then you had President Macron show up. Would you agree with that assessment? And is there a danger that Prime Minister Pashinyan could find himself in the same situation? Well, not same, but let's say vaguely similar situation to that Saakashvili in Georgia found himself in, this very pro-Western prime minister.
Yeah, when it comes to the European Union, I think it's clear they also had their preference in the race. And the reason for that, I think the main reason for that is the situation in Georgia. Having lost Georgia as an important partner in the South Caucasus, the European Union now views Armenia as its only remaining partner in the South Caucasus. Russia is, of course, also there, the Russian factor. The fact that the current government tries to conduct this diversification policy, distance itself from Russia in important areas, and that the main opposition parties are pro-Russian, plays a role in these calculations. But I agree in a way that probably the European Union still should have been more reserved when it came to the reaction to this situation. I think these summits held in Yerevan just 1 month before the vote played a role in influencing the voters' preferences. The bigger problem is the European Union's inability to basically uphold some of its principles, because in the past year we have been witnessing certain problematic trends in Armenia's democratic trajectory, and the EU and other member states as well have been silent on these developments. The latest one being this politically motivated case against political activist Arturo Ciprian, who was just jailed because of his debate with the prime minister during the campaign. Although the EU ambassador mentioned during one of his meetings this case, but we haven't seen a strong reaction from the European Union when it comes to issues related to democracy and human rights. I think that might work in the short run, but in the long run, that might create a huge reputational damage to the European Union standing in Armenia, because the attraction of the EU for countries like Armenia has always been its value system and its principles. And now when we have a more geopolitical, more pragmatic EU, especially in our region, that kind of creates problems. In the meantime, I don't think that there is a danger of Pashinyan becoming the Saakashvili, because if we compare the current Armenian government's policy towards Russia with Georgia's policy vis-a-vis Russia in 2000s, in Georgia's case, it was very black and white. So they had very clear aspirations. They basically knew what they wanted. In this case, when there is a talk about Armenia's EU membership prospect, it's more about the domestic politics than an actual foreign policy goal. Everybody, as I've already said, in Armenia and in Brussels and elsewhere, understand that at this point, there is not a realistic agenda of European integration or EU membership for Armenia. It will take a lot of time, a lot of homework to be even close to that. So in this case, a lot will depend on Russia's actions, actually. If they decide that they want to move forward, continue with this harsher rhetoric and harsher actions towards Armenia, they might push Armenia towards that path. But I think there is a likelihood that both Moscow and Yerevan will find a new modus operandi in the coming months. Here, the important issues are Russia's structural presence on the ground. So these economic sanctions and harsher rhetoric actually started even before the pre-election period, when the Armenian government started talking about transferring the management right of Armenia's railway system from a Russian company to a third party. That's when Russia started basically threatening Armenia with consequences. There are other sensitive issues for Russia, like the future of the new nuclear power plant. So if Yerevan and Moscow manage to find some sort of a solution for this issue, I think there is a possibility that this current escalation might calm down.
Well, just to remind the audience about the activist who Pashinyan had his run-in with, this is a displaced person from Nagorno-Karabakh who was assailing the prime minister for basically, renouncing all claims and quote unquote abandoning Nagorno-Karabakh. And this made Pashinyan very angry. And he basically said, why are you, if you're so concerned about your own, Karabakh, then why are you even alive still? You should be dead. You should have been fighting, kind of thing, which was obviously a very, very, very harsh response. Coming back to the European Union and its leverage, if it can't offer membership, then it really doesn't have that much leverage. And even with the countries that it did offer, membership to or begin membership negotiations with, and I'm referring specifically to Turkey, in recent years, we've seen it sort of completely, well, on the one hand, making it clear that Turkey will never join, but at the same time also not saying anything about human rights in Turkey, which have really gone down the toilet, as it were. So my next question is about, well, Turkey. And we all know that one of the main pillars of Prime Minister Pashinyan's campaign was peace with Turkey and peace with Azerbaijan. But he did not get enough votes to be able to change the constitution, which is one of Azerbaijan's demands. Can we address that and how you see the future trajectory of peace talks with Turkey on the one hand and with Azerbaijan on the other?
Yeah, before addressing the Turkey question, I would just want to make one small remark about the European Union. I think there has been a lot of progress when it comes to Armenia-EU relations. If we are to compare the current state of affairs with the situation we had 3-4 years ago, there has been a significant progress. Armenia has started a visa liberalization process. It has signed a new strategic document with the European Union. The European Union is an important actor when it comes to the support, especially financial support to Armenia's reform process, and it's also investing a lot in its infrastructure. And I think the European Union also wants to become part of the TRIP project. They are trying to find a role for them in this. I think the important thing in this relationship is not to put the bar too high, because if we're not able to reach that bar, there will be a lot of disillusionment. When it comes to Armenia-Turkey relations, yes, the outcome of this vote might actually affect that prospect. As you rightly mentioned, Azerbaijan still has this very old precondition of Armenia changing its constitution. And to do that, Pashinyan needed a supermajority, constitutional majority in the parliament, which he didn't get. So at this point, even to be able to call a referendum, Pashinyan needs those votes, like 2/3 of the parliamentary seats, which he doesn't have. I do not exclude he will find a way around. He will probably manage, I don't know, attract some of other MPs from the opposition parties. That's a possibility. But as things stand now, it is not possible just technically. And that might create a lot of problems in the peace process with Azerbaijan, but also for the prospects of broader regional stabilization and border opening of communications. So if Azerbaijan doesn't abandon these preconditions, that means that Armenia and Azerbaijan won't be signing the peace treaty that was initial during the Washington summit last August. Technically speaking, you still can have an unsigned peace treaty and the TRIP project that might start functioning.
Could you just explain what the TRIP project is? Because maybe our audience doesn't understand, just very briefly.
Yeah, so TRIP stands for Trump Route for International Peace and Prosperity. That's basically a communication project agreed upon during the Washington summit in 2025. So in recent years, this issue of connection between mainland Azerbaijan and its exclave of Nakhchivan has been one of the most troubling agendas in the bilateral relations and in the peace agenda. Before the Trump administration, the Biden administration was trying to find a solution because Armenia had its own red lines and Azerbaijan had its demands. The Azerbaijani government, for example, has been saying that Azerbaijani passengers passing through Armenian territory shouldn't be facing Armenian border guards. Then Armenia was basically insisting on preserving its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and jurisdiction. So what TRIP arrangement does, it basically marries these two concepts, Armenian and Azerbaijani concept. It introduces a private company that will be controlling this communication, a TRIP development company, where Armenia will have a stake, 26% stake. And this company will be in charge of border crossing, border checking, but the Armenian government will have the final decision-making powers.
May I interrupt you there just for a second, Tigran? Don't Russians now patrol that border with Azerbaijan? In fact, all of Armenia's external land borders.
No, the Russians patrol and control the border with Iran, and this is the area where TRIP is supposed to be going through. The Russian border guards actually were withdrawn from the Armenia-Azerbaijan border in 2024, if I'm not mistaken, and that was part of this diversification strategy or the strategy of distancing Armenia from Russia.
But they are on the Turkish border, right? Because
yes, they are on the Turkish border.
They're just not on the Azerbaijani border anymore.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct. And they are also on the Armenia-Iran border, but I think there is an ongoing process of basically withdrawing the Russians from those areas. At this point, it's a capacity issue for Armenia. Armenia doesn't have the prepared personnel to substitute the Russians, but the Russians wanted the control over this communication for many years, and especially after the ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh, when the Russian peacekeepers left Nagorno-Karabakh, this issue was one of the key issues and agendas for Russia to have some sort of control over Armenia and Azerbaijan. So in that sense, the Washington summit and Trump's mediations were a huge geopolitical loss for Russia. But yeah, that's the TRIP project, which basically reconciles the concerns of two sides. But if we're talking about just the TRIP project, it doesn't really make sense for Armenia. For Armenia, this whole process to make sense, it needs the full opening of the Armenia-Turkey border. It needs to be able to use Azerbaijani territory to re-enter its territory, to travel to Russia and to Iran. And that's when the peace treaty comes in. Because, as I've said, theoretically, we can still have an unsigned peace treaty, but a functioning TRIP communication project. But for that TRIP communication project to become something bigger than that, to become a full opening of regional communications, we need to have the peace treaty. Because Turkey, as you know, in its turn, has the precondition for full normalization as the signing of the peace treaty between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
So it's a chicken and egg catch-22 kind of situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So if Turkey keeps that precondition in place, then potentially we might be stuck in this situation with closed borders or with partly open borders for many years to come. And that's an absolute loss for Armenia.
So my next question, I totally agree with you, is then, do you believe that this Trump administration will now put as much pressure as it can bring to bear on Azerbaijan to relax its demands? We haven't heard them say anything, by the way, about Turkey, Armenia. Have you noticed? In all of this, we've not once heard them say, oh, and Turkey, by the way, needs to establish diplomatic ties and open its borders. So what do you foresee there?
Yeah, I think the administration is trying to work behind the closed doors with Turkey to make their position a bit more flexible. When it comes to Azerbaijan, I mean, there should be that realization that, there should be some pressure on Azerbaijan. Although I don't know how invested this administration will be on this issue, because Azerbaijan has basically instrumentalized this bilateral progress with Armenia to sell it to the Trump administration and to establish some sort of strategic relations with the Trump administration, because with the Biden administration, I think the bilateral relations were at a historic low. So I think the Trump administration has the leverage to use. The big question is whether they will be willing to use it, because I think this is important for them as well. The TREAT project will make an economic sense, or might have an economic sense, if it becomes a part of something bigger than just that communication. The idea is that it should become part of the middle corridor, that some of the cargo that is going through Georgia should be redirected to the southern direction, that potentially like cargo will be coming from Central Asia to Azerbaijan and then to Armenia, that there will be some other communications as well, not just the railway, but also cables and electric cables and internet cables.
Well, it's quite complicated if you look at the map, because you also have the Caspian Sea, and it doesn't necessarily all add up, certainly not financially in some respects. And there is the Iran factor that you mentioned. Do you think that we all know that Iran does not like this project at all? It doesn't like the idea of a US company, US security along its borders. Do you think that there's a way of getting Iranian buy-in, and is it necessary? And I would ask the same question about Russia. And if you could, achieve those two goals, would we then not perhaps have a win-win all around and a diffused situation?
Yeah, so when the Washington summit happened and it was announced about the trip arrangement, I think there was a split reaction coming from Iran. The clerical circles and the security apparatus reacted in a very harsh way. They basically threatened to target any Americans that will be on the ground on their mutual border. And then the diplomats were more diplomatic. And I think the Armenian government did a good job at communicating this project to the Iranian government in that period. And right before the war with Iran, I think there were public statements by the foreign minister and their ambassador to Armenia that, Iran doesn't view this project as the extraterritorial corridor that Azerbaijan was threatening to take over. But then the war started. A lot of changes happened in the elite. We don't know who are these new people, how hardline they are, what are their positions on these issues. Now they are focusing on other issues. So we still need to wait and see what will happen with their stance and with their reaction. With Russia, it's also quite complicated because, as I've said, it's a big geopolitical loss for them. But their reaction, the initial reaction, wasn't harsh. I think they even welcomed this development. And there are several reasons for that. The first reason is, of course, the Trump administration. They want to build some ties with this administration. They probably have some expectations from them when it comes to other issues like the war in Ukraine. And at least publicly, they haven't been very critical of the Trump administration's involvement in the South Caucasus and in this issue. For Russia now, the big rivals and enemies are the European Union. So they do not publicly criticize the Trump administration. I think they also need this communication for a stable land link with Turkey. That has been one of their strategic goals in the past years. Of course, they won't be controlling this communication, but they still can use it. And by the way, after the Washington summit, Russia was the first actor using this positive momentum, basically using the Azerbaijani territory for transit to Armenia. But when it comes to Russia, there is another important topic I think we have touched upon. That's the future of the railway system. So TREAT won't be part of this Russian-controlled railway system of Armenia. But for TREAT is supposed to connect with other parts of Armenia's railway system that are now under Russian control. I think if the Russians manage to preserve control over the rest of the railway system, they will be more relaxed. But if Armenia moves forward and tries to take this control, these management rights from the Russians, we might expect some harsher reaction. So a lot will depend on this dynamic.
I think that's the magic kind of formula, isn't it? And we saw a similar scenario play out when they were building the Baku-Ceyhan pipeline, and after Russia got a stake in it, that's when things started really happening, moving. So clearly, however much Russian influence is receding, however much Russia is bogged down in this awful war in Ukraine, you can never dismiss Russia as a very, very powerful, you know, in the arc of history and in the future actor in its own hinterland, because that's pretty much how it sees it, right? This isn't Syria, this isn't Libya. You don't get to play quite as freely in the South Caucasus as you do in those other areas with which it doesn't have a historical relationship. So, final question. I mean, you touched upon human rights, democracy, and this is Pashinyan's third term. I mean, when I spoke to ordinary people, many of them didn't even talk about geopolitics, unsurprisingly. People care about their pocketbooks, and I mean, almost all the people I spoke to, and God knows I spoke to many, and I did travel quite a bit, all said they'd vote for Pashinyan because he changed their lives for the better. That economically the country was thriving, that the roads were better, the hospitals were better. This seems to be a key factor. Do you believe that this present economic momentum, given the broader fragility of the global economy in the light of what's happening in Iran, is this sustainable for Armenia? What are let me put it like, rephrase the question. What are the main challenges facing Prime Minister Pashinyan, who really has changed Armenia in many positive ways? Let's grant him that.
Yeah, I think in this case, we're mainly talking about people living in regions who have seen some changes happening in their daily life. Because for many years, especially the regional settlements, people living in the regions have been neglected. And the change that this government brought is that they starting investing in this region. And that's why when you look at Pashinyan's electoral base, it's mainly in the regions. I think he won predominantly in all of the regions. In Yerevan, he just had 42%.
And you mean
Of the vote.
rural areas when you say regions, right?
Yeah, rural areas, but also regional towns and cities.
Sure.
So
Outside
Yerevan,
Yerevan.
yeah. Armenia is a very Yerevan-centric country. So 70% of its economy is in Yerevan or around. Every important, government building, institution is in Yerevan. So people living outside of Yerevan have been and still are, in a way, neglected. So when he started building all these schools, kindergarten, roads, he basically changed a lot in these people's life. And that's why they support him. But when it comes to the economic growth, of course, we have slightly touched upon this topic. It is in a way also connected with the start of the Russo-Ukrainian war, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because a lot of Russian capital started coming to Armenia. Armenia has started, not Armenia as a country, but Armenian companies started using this situation for parallel export and import, and that basically benefited the country economically. So in a way, the economic growth of the past several years is a situational growth. It's not structural. It's not that they have been, huge economic reforms and that help the country to develop. And here as well, the big question is the reliance of the Armenian economy on the Russian economy. So if Russia decides to push forward with its aggressive policies towards Armenia, then the economic gains of the past year might also be in danger, because at this point there are no, quick fixes to this situation. Of course, the European Union has just introduced like a short-term support for Armenian agricultural producers when Russia started banning these products, but these are just short-term solutions.
Not
Armenia
sustainable. No.
Yeah, Armenia is still in the Eurasian Economic Union, and it doesn't want to leave it. Coming back to your first question about the choice between the West and Russia, that's why it's more complicated than that. So it will take a lot of time. It will take a lot of homework. I don't know whether the government is capable of doing all these reforms and basically finding alternative markets for Armenian producers or not. So there are a lot of factors at play. I think the other thing that our viewers should understand that, we're not talking about a pro-democratic government against some authoritarian forces. Of course, the opposition is anti-democratic. Some of the opposition parties are clearly pro-Russian and affiliated with Russia, but this government as well has been doing a lot of things that are not aligned with democratic principles. It has been violating rule of law, the constitution, democratic procedures, and that's a dilemma. Once again, the Armenian voter had to choose between these lesser of evils. Pashinyan once again basically won in this very dichotomous choice. But if this continues like that, if everything is decided by financial administrative resources and you don't really have a democratic alternative to this dichotomy of the current government and the previous regimes or pro-Russian parties, then I don't think we have really positive scenarios when it comes to democratic development.
That's a very, very key point. And, it's really important that Pashinyan allows a credible opposition to develop and doesn't feel sufficiently threatened that he starts locking them up, kind of like Turkey's been doing. Well, I mean, I lived in Armenia in the mid-2000s. So in a sense, of course, I have a slightly different perspective in that I saw Armenia when it was really struggling and had a really, really autocratic government, and elections involved, massive ballot stuffing where people in black jackets, goons, would pull up in their SUVs and just dump sacks full of pre-stamped votes in favor of the incumbent. So, yeah, I think, he's blemishing his own democratic record. And let's hope that, Europeans, I don't have much faith in that, but not to say that the Europeans don't do good work, and all the civil society projects are hugely valuable. Let's see. Thank you so much for joining us, Tigran. It's always so great to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Amberine. It's always a pleasure to talk to you as well.
Well, that's it for now. Thank you for tuning in, and do please rate the show on Spotify, Apple, or on any other platform you stream it on. We really appreciate your support. Goodbye.